In the Jewish world today, we're generally familiar with the structure of Jewish life as it manifests in contemporary times. And we have categories of people, of Sephardi Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, and so on. But there's a particular group of Jews which creates its own subculture, which is the Western Sephardi Jews, the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, which has its own distinct religious practices and I would say also cultural identity or cultural practices as well. And in previous lecture series, we spoke about the history of this community and spoke about its origins in Spain and Portugal, the experience of expulsion and inquisition, crypto-Jewish identity or converso identity, and ultimately their emergence and establishment of Jewish communities in Western Europe and in the Americas. And so people sometimes refer to as this Atlantic Portuguese Jewish diaspora. And in that series, we laid the overview of kind of the community, of where it comes from and how it ended up where they ended up creating communities. The objective of this series is to look at not just a question of, where did they come from, but to really look at what is unique about who they are, who we are, right? Who we are here at Bevis Marks and in the Spanish and Portuguese diaspora, and looking at that question over time and kind of looking back at its establishment in the 17th century or late 16th century and kind of seeing how that has, in some ways evolved, in some ways remained the same over, 400 years or so. And it's important because we're looking at what is a distinct Jewish community, which if you would have gone, into places 100 years ago, you would have found distinct communities all across, the Jewish world, right? Because you would have found communities that had been in the same place for centuries, sometimes a millennia, right? So you would have found communities in North Africa and in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe, right? And those communities would have been there for a very, very long time. But of course, the upheavals of the past century, right, whether from the Holocaust or kind of persecution of Jews in Arab lands following the establishment of the State of Israel, means that most of those communities have been uprooted, have been forced to relocate, and that's caused with it a degree of loss of identity, or at least kind of like a way of doing business, as it were, right, and kind of a homogenization and kind of an establishment of new cultural and kind of communal patterns and norms for those communities as Jewish people find themselves in, what for them was new environments, new places, new realities, right? From simply being in places like America to obviously a completely new reality of being the majority, right, in a Jewish country. And so all those things have changed. So one of the few communities that's really remained in the same place over centuries, right, are these Spanish and Portuguese Jews, because they had the good fortune, right, of establishing themselves in Western Europe. Obviously, some of those places were impacted by the Holocaust, but also in the Americas, right? And so as a result, you actually have some communities that have been essentially in the same place, sometimes in the very same building, right, for hundreds of years, which has allowed for a degree of continuity where we can actually kind of get a bit of a window into the way Jewish life would have been organized centuries ago, certainly within this community, but probably in other communities as well. And so what I'm going to look at in this opening talk is one aspect of the religion and culture of the Western Sephardim, and that is its communal structure and religious hierarchy. So I'll break down what I mean by that, but it's really interesting. We'll see how it's rooted to the history of this community, right? Which, if you haven't seen those lectures, I'd suggest that you take a look at them because it'll give the kind of the context for this, and kind of will help us kind of understand what makes them tick, how this community kind of operates, which in ways that you can still see, today, which is quite amazing because, when you think of like Jews in the world, right, you don't only think of, the Jews of London as being, an ancient Jewish community, but actually in a lot of ways, this is the most ancient Jewish community in the world today in terms of the same synagogue building, the same community, right, descendants of those founders, and many other people, of course, as well, but that essentially it's the same community in the same place, which you don't really find any place else in the world, today, unfortunately. So one of, I would say, and this is kind of just by way of introduction, probably like the key element, which is really kind of like distinct, really important to understand the Spanish and Portuguese, is that it has a highly centralized lay leadership structure, okay? And so we'll break down what that means, but it means that you really have this kind of pyramid of power, right, with this lay leadership at top that has kind of a control over everything below it. Which we'll talk about what that means. And again, we'll relate that to the history of the community to help explain how it is that it came to be that way. And the reason I say that is it's not necessarily something that we should assume that that's how the community should have been structured, right? It's not necessarily, oh, that's just how things work, because you have lots of different models for how communities historically have been structured, and it hasn't necessarily been, a community ruled by a group of lay leaders in a highly centralized fashion with kind of a top-down type of model, right? So let's just kind of do a bit of comparative religion, as it were, but by that I mean comparing to other Jewish communities, right? So you could think, for example, right, and kind of let's say look to, Eastern Europe, kind of in the early modern or kind of into the modern era, and you look at Hasidic Jewish communities, right? So you think of those communities, who was in charge? Any thoughts? The Rebbe, right? The Rebbe of whatever Hasidic sect you're talking about, they were the authority, right? They are the ones who were in charge, right? There was a very strong kind of communal structure that was governed, as it were. I don't know if you could use the word governance, right? But that was kind of controlled by the Rebbe, right? The Rebbe is the ultimate authority, right? So not a lay leadership, right? Kind of governance. It's the Rebbe that would be in control. You may have had times in communities where essentially the community is governed by a particularly prosperous individual, right? So in a sense, it might be a family that's actually in charge, right? So if you look back to kind of some places in Central Europe, you would have had a model, again, kind of pre-modern times, but where you would have had, maybe what they refer to sometimes as the court Jew, right? Where essentially there would have been like one Jew who had this like elevated position, would have represented the Jewish community to whatever the local, power was in that place. And in a sense, it was their community. It was their, they were the ones who kind of governed the way that the community would have operated. And the rest of the Jewish people that were there would have been kind of reliant on, the will of that person, right, to kind of organize, many elements of Jewish life. But essentially it would have been a person or a family that would have been the ones who were in control. And you would have just been kind of almost, their visitors or hanging on their coattails in a sense to be there. Obviously, another kind of structure you could think of is one which is like democracy, right? Where the community is, maybe you have elected members who kind of oversee, the decision making within the community, but that leadership is elected by the constituents of the congregation, right? And so ultimate authority lay in the people, right, of the community, right? So these are all lots of different kinds of ways that you can organize a Jewish community, right? And certainly when you think about, government in general, right, there's been many forms of government in different places in the world at different times. And so it's not surprising that even in kind of the structure of Jewish communal life, you will find different models that have been followed that would kind of explain how, would dictate what Jewish life, how it should be structured at the same time. If I had to use a term to kind of describe this kind of highly centralized lay leadership in the Spanish and Portuguese community, certainly in the early modern era, so kind of, the 16th into the 19th century, right, early 19th century, and there's still vestiges of it, which we'll talk about, essentially an oligarchy, right, where you have like a core group of people who are in charge, yeah, and they, in a sense, select their successors, right? And so it's not a democracy. It's not up to the people to decide who the leadership is. It's not the rabbi who's in charge. It's not a particular family that's in charge, but it's a group of people who are kind of in charge, probably originally because they were well-to-do, were people who could finance the needs of the community, and they were the ones, and they would have been the ones who were in charge. But an early, kind of an important component of this, right, is also the fact, and we'll kind of talk about this a little bit more later, right, is that kind of like all the institutions of the community are under this authority, right? So it's not just the synagogue, right, but it's kind of like all the elements of community are under this ruling body, right, which we refer to as the Mahamad, right, the Mahamad. And this Mahamad, right, this kind of like established pillar, as it were, of the community, right, Ma'amad, right, those standing, those kind of in this kind of this position of leadership in the community, would have, wielded authority, And what's interesting is there are different bodies still associated with that leadership. So they had a really interesting kind of government structure. And again, there's different Spanish-Portuguese communities as we've spoken about, right? You have the ones that were kind of in Italy and in Amsterdam and in London and in France and in North America, which becomes the United States, and in Caribbean communities and things like that. So they're not necessarily all the same. And we spoke about the relationship between Amsterdam and Dutch colonies was different than London and the British colonies, and therefore Jewish communities also had slightly different structures between British and England, and maybe we'll talk about that a little bit in terms of some differences as we get a bit later. But just to say some of the things we're saying, I'm kind of generalizing, but there will be kind of differences locally in these different communities. But kind of just generally speaking, right, you have this Mahamad, right, which is this oligarchy of sorts, and in some communities, you have actually two bodies that are kind of this leadership, and that's the way it was here in London, but not necessarily in smaller communities, but where you would have the Mahamad, which are kind of the government, right? Or in a British context, we might think of as the House of Commons, right? The people who are kind of currently, in government, and then you also had what was called the Board of Elders, which kind of in a British context, if you go back to kind of before the Age of Reform, right, before the 19th century, would have been the kind of authority that the House of Lords would have, right, which is where essentially laws are put forward by the House of Commons, but they can only be enacted if the House of Lords approves them, right? If the House of Lords doesn't like it, they kick it back to the House of Commons. You have like vestiges of that today, but essentially you don't. The House of Lords doesn't have real power anymore. And again, we'll talk about the changes within this community over the centuries, but essentially that's how it was. So basically anyone who was on the Mahamad, they were the ones who ran the day-to-day operations, right? They made the day-to-day kind of decisions, but any decisions they made that kind of were like more more about kind of policy, it then had to be ratified by the Board of Elders. And who's the Board of Elders? Anyone who used to be on the Mahamad, right? Because the Mahamad in this structure were people who would serve for 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, depending, and then kind of they would go off of it and they become part of the Board of Elders, right? And so you had this kind of interesting structure. Incidentally, with the Mahamad, is if you were asked to do it and you declined, you had to pay a fine, right? So the famous story with that is the Disraeli family. So the father of Benjamin Disraeli was Isaac Disraeli. He was asked to be on the Mahamad. He refused. Without getting into the whole story of why, he refused and then received a bill in the mail. He received that bill repeatedly over a number of years and finally decided not only is he not paying the bill, he's going to resign his affiliation, right? And went on to convert his children to the Church of England when his son Benjamin was 12 years old, right? Just shy of his bar mitzvah, right? So Benjamin then kind of identifies as Church of England, which the rest is a different story, right? But essentially, it's related to that kind of history for how it would work. And as you would expect, the Mahamad was usually wealthy people in the community, people who kind of had, maybe experience in governance, right? Those people who would be kind of invited to take up those positions. And then the other kind of power within the community, but I wouldn't know that I would call it power, but I would say maybe degrees of authority would of course be the rabbinic, right, authority, right, which would be either the chacham of the community, right, the rabbi of the community, and kind of by extension, the beth din, right, the bet din, right, the religious court of the community, right? But of course, they're dealing with different matters, right? The bet din is dealing with, halachic issues. Is this permitted? Is that not permitted? Is this an acceptable marriage? Is this, questions of Jewish identity? Issues, issuing marriage and divorce. Sometimes, though, getting into complicated waters when they wanted to make a judgment on is something considered heresy or not, right? So kind of things of a religious nature. And of course, they had a degree of autonomy in that, but ultimately, right, they were hired by the Mahamad, right? So in a sense, the ultimate authority, right? So it's not like the Rebbe, right? And the Hasidic, right? The lay leaders are the ultimate authority. It's their community, right? You're hired by them, but you're hired to then have the authority as the rabbi to make, those decisions. Though in theory, they don't like the decisions you make, right? They do have the right, as the people who are your employers, right, to remove you from that position. And so you end up kind of having, these almost like different groups where you kind of think of like the legislature, right? The people who have to authorize the rules. You have your kind of judicial branch, right? So you have these different branches of government, which are interesting. As I mentioned, in some of the smaller communities, you may not have that. You may have just a single board that controls. And sometimes in those communities, for example, in New York, in their Spanish Portuguese community, you would sit till you're 70, right? So you go on, and then that's it. You're on. If you're 30 when you brought on, you're there for 40 years, right? Unless you resign your position, right? So, and again, you selected by your predecessor. Right, so it could be slightly different in different places. That's kind of like historically the way that it would have been. In some places, that's kind of carried on even into modern days. In some places, like in London, we'll see there's been some changes over the centuries. But let's kind of take up how did we get here, right? Why is it that the Spanish and Portuguese Jews had this kind of model of government? And it relates a lot to their origins and kind of their story and kind of where they come from and the places that they ended up. So the one thing to kind of just like appreciate is, again, this idea that it's all centralized. So in Hebrew, right, we refer to the community as Kahal Kadosh Sha'ar HaShamayim, right? The name of this community is Gate of Heaven, Sha'ar HaShamayim. It's called Bevis Marks just because that's the name of the road, but the real name is Sha'ar HaShamayim. But all of the Spanish Portuguese communities, if you ever see their kind of Hebrew names, or even in English, it says Kuf Kuf, or KK, right? Kahal Kadosh, which means holy congregation. And historians refer to this as the Kihila model, where essentially you have a community, right? And that community is one entity, right? So if you think of like Jewish life today, so you have a synagogue, and you have your schools, and you may have your, your kosher authority, and you may have your mikvah association, and you may have your cemeteries, right? And in theory, those could all be completely separate institutions, right? That are kind of have their own governance, their own, kind of independence from one another, right? But historically, right, the kihila, which is the way a lot of communities were, because communities were smaller, it was all the same thing. It was all the same thing. So you may have kind of like committees that kind of dealt with kind of day-to-day matters with those various, shall we say, sub-charities, but all of it is under the authority of the Mahamad, right, of the ultimate authority within the community, right? And that's the way this community was. And you can see elements of that still today in the community that have kind of carried on, right? So originally when this community was founded, it was the only Jewish community in London, right? And even when another one was, that was Ashkenazi, this was Sephardi, so there was a sense that each of them needed their own institutions, right? So it has its own Bet Din, it had its own schools, it had its own cemeteries, it had its own mikveh, right? It had its own charity kind of body that would support the poor, right? Everything that it had was under the rule of the Mahamad, right? And it was their responsibility essentially to decide how funds should be distributed, right, or managed in order to support all of these various charities, right, which is what they were, right, that constituted this kihila, right, this congregation, this community, right? So everything is like really centralized. Everything is, kind of very, again, like this kind of pyramid type of structure. And even if there are kind of committees that kind of have a degree of responsibility, the ultimate authority still, if there were kind of real issues, would have been determined by the Mahamad or the elders, as it were. So one of the interesting things you find about it in terms of like this is that there are regulations for the community. It was called askamot, and so you find that there are kind of like really detailed regulations for the governance of the community that go back to the 17th century, go back to the 16th century, right, that lay out all the rules of how the governance is meant to operate. So it's not just kind of everyone, flying by the seat of their pants, right? It's actual, there's rules and regulations. And so in a sense, you think of like a constitution, right? They have like, they're in charge, but there are rules that they have to follow, and obviously rules are meant to be broken, right? Meaning you can change rules if there is a consensus and the board of elders agree and so on. And so over the centuries, there may be adjustments made to the askamot, right, which are these kind of agreed principles for the governance of the community. And so, in a sense, and this is what we're going to see, it feels very much to a degree like you think of like, a corporate structure, right? You have your, what's it called in kind of contemporary terms? Like you have to have like your, submit to your charity commission, not just your board of directors, but like also like what are your kind of internal regulations, right? For like how you're governing, right? That's like part of your submission to the charity commission is like how it all works, right? So that's essentially, right, what we're talking about within this, right? So in a lot of ways, it feels kind of very modern, right? It feels very corporate, and that's really what it is, right? And that's the kind of point I want to get to. So where did this come from? So I mentioned in one of the history lectures, I think the one about how the Spanish Portuguese Jews ended up in Western Europe, right? That there's a very clear kind of progression of these communities, right? You find these communities first in Italy, and then you find them in Amsterdam, and then you find them in London, right? Kind of depending on the decades from the late 17th to the late 18th century. And each of the communities in succession will adopt askamot. And often in the preamble to the askamot, they will reference the model for the askamot that they are adopting, right? So Livorno, maybe we'll talk about Venice. Amsterdam, we'll talk about Livorno. London, we'll talk about Amsterdam, right? Because each of these communities kind of act as the mother synagogue to the synagogue that comes after them. And a lot of times the people who found those new communities some of them it's because they've come from those previous communities and then, found that they can now settle in another place in Western Europe where Jews previously haven't been able to live. And they may be joined by other kind of, refugees, as it were, coming out of Portugal, right? And they'll kind of establish a new community, and they'll say, hey, this is what our cousins have done, in Italy, or this is what our, I've just moved from Amsterdam to London, this is how we do it in Amsterdam. And they say, great, let's kind of just take a look at it, see if there's any adjustments we have to make, but essentially use that as the model for how the governance should work in this new place, right? And you then find that into the New World as well, right? Where they are basically looking at, the regulations of the Old World, and again, essentially following that structure for their new communities, right? And so that's obviously kind of just like helpful to understand like where it comes from. And again, the askamot itself are like, there's people who research them too, because like they're really interesting in terms of just kind of what are the regulations, why are the regulations like that, and so on. But obviously one of the key things you find in them is like very tight control, which we'll talk about why in a second. As I mentioned, this very much follows a corporate entity kind of structure. And the reason for that is something that, again, we previously spoke about, is that in a lot of places where these Spanish and Portuguese Jews end up, they are in places where before they get to, there is no pre-existing Jewish community, right? There may, in history, have been other Jewish communities there, but Jews have been expelled kind of in the late medieval period from all of Western Europe, essentially. So even when Jews get to places where once upon a time there haven't been Jews in those places for some time. So when they get there often is a need for there to be a formalized process of settlement, right? Because these are ostensibly, right, these are Christian countries, and they're grappling for themselves. It's like, well, how do non-Christians fit into this country? Are they citizens if they live here? Are they not citizens? What rights do they have? Do they use our courts? Do they have to govern themselves? Right? How does the tax structure work? Right? They're trying to like make sense of it because there's like almost like this dissonance. Like, how can, if this is a Christian country, how can Jews, like, under what framework do they live here? So depending on the place, and again, there's something we spoke on in some of the history lectures, in each place it's slightly different in terms of kind of the local politics and the local kind of history of maybe religious conflict, right? So it all plays a role in kind of how they try to incorporate diversity into their societies. But in some of these places like Livorno, right, where their Jews are invited, and the Portuguese Jews are invited by the Medicis, right, to create this free port to help create, wealth for, Florence, essentially. So these Portuguese Jews are given, rights of settlement, but their settlement there is like highly defined, right? There's like very clear regulations for how the community should be structured. And in a sense, the Jews who are there are not seen as individuals. They are seen as an entity, the Jewish community, right? So it's not Jews who are kind of voluntarily choosing to be part of the synagogue. You are there as part of the Jewish community if you are a Jew. And in a sense, you're talking about this kind of early modern era with the beginning of like corporations, right? International trading, entities. You think of like, the trading companies, the Dutch East India Company and those kinds of things. So that kind of model is being used to kind of organize various various foreign groups that are going to be settling in these various port cities, right? So in London, you might think of members of the Hanseatic League, right, who are living in London, right? And so with each of these groups, there's kind of like a negotiation around, what are their rights of settlement and how does it work? So in a place like Livorno, it's like really very much like the government is interested in kind of the leadership of the community, and then the leadership of the community deals with everything themselves beneath them, right? So it's like a very tight governance structure, and it's like organized as a corporation, right? That's essentially what it is in the eyes of the people outside of them, right? Jews are seen as the company, a nation, right? They're not seen as individual people. In London, it'll be slightly different. Jews will be seen more as individuals. They'll have rights of citizenship, but there'll be friction because, again, the models for organization will still be based on those earlier models where the authority really, truly did have authority. Here, Jews will be, in theory, a bit more voluntary if they want to be part of it or not, because, as we spoke about in London, there never has been a formalized readmission policy that dictated under what conditions Jews can live here. They're just all of a sudden living here. And so the structure is a bit more nebulous, as it were. So the community, as it established themselves, will borrow models from those earlier communities, but they're not necessarily completely applicable to this new reality because the Mahamad is kind of asserting its authority over other Jews, but not because it has been vested with that authority by the government in the way that they may be invested with that authority in places like Venice or Livorno, to a lower degree in Amsterdam, and certainly not the case in London. So it gets a bit messy, and that's what I'm saying. Each community will kind of take the Askamot and that kind of corporate model from earlier communities, but it somehow has greater or less applicability or kind of relevance depending on the scenario in which Jews find themselves living, kind of in these early modern port cities. But I would say there's one element which kind of like underpins an element of these askamot, and you often find it kind of towards the very beginning of them, which is an element of anxiety. There's like a great amount of anxiety. The Jewish settlement is conditional, right? That they cannot be sure that their ability to live freely and to trade and to worship as Jews in these various places is going to persist, right? And so, for example, in London's Askamot, right, the very first Askama talks about that there should not be divisions within the community because Charles II told them, you're welcome to live here as long as you don't cause disorder. Now, we don't necessarily have evidence of him saying that, right? Charles II, right, is on the throne in the 1660s, right? So after the Republic ends, right, after Cromwell, right, the Jews arrive under Cromwell, but then afterwards, right, when the monarchy is restored, so, and they kind of establish formally these Askamot, they at least have this understanding that that's the expectation, right? You can be here, but like, you got to behave yourself. What does that mean? It means that like they don't want problems, right? So they don't want infighting within the Jewish community, right? That things that would kind of spill out, right? You're here as long as you're all quiet, right? And that's like something that gets repeated in Askamot for a very long time. They keep repeating that kind of mentality, that attitude, which again reflects this sense that, Jews are living here. Presumably it's been accepted that Jews can be here. In some places maybe there's even a formal agreement. But you know what? Things can change. Things can change, right? It's not until you maybe get to the 19th century, right, where you really have, or certainly into the 18th century, that you have more of a sense of, tolerance and diversity is kind of really part of the like way, society functions, that maybe Jews feel more secure. But certainly in the 17th century, they feel like they don't necessarily know the direction of traffic. Maybe things will go back to the way things were in the 15th century. So they end up basically having a lot of these almost like draconian policies where they kind of insist on this very strong top-down model because they want to control the activities of the community, lest, basically too much individuality asserts itself and you end up having internal conflict that spills out into the public realm and ultimately leads to a kind of what's the right word here, where you end up having a situation where it ends up destabilizing, that's the word, right? Destabilizing the position of the community in terms of its ability to continue to be here, right? And that in theory Jews might be, this kind of corporate charter that they've been given, in a sense, will be revoked, and then there won't be any basis on which Jews are living in these Christian countries, and they would be forced to leave, right? That's the concern, and so you see how that manifests itself in elements of the community. So which is what I want to kind of shift to now, where we kind of like talk about how does this authority manifest. So one is something I referred to already, right? Is the fact that the people in charge are the Muhammad, right? They hire the rabbis. Rabbis are employees. They have authority. They have the rabbis have their area of expertise, and and therefore can make religious decisions. But ultimately, right, they're hired, right? It's not their community. The community is the Muhammad's community, right? The membership's community, as it were. So one of the you see manifestations of that even today. Meaning that's not just a strange thing today, because nowadays most rabbis are hired, right? And it's not unless it's like their personal shul, or you have a community that really kind of like chooses the rabbi, but then the rabbi is now the one in charge, right? In many Jewish communities, that's not the way it works nowadays, but it's a very modern kind of thing where it's like the people in charge are the members, yeah? So one of the kind of relics of that within this community is even in terms of like the authorization to worship. So there's a practice that still exists within this community, which is the beginning of services, one of the members of the Muhammad, though today we call them the Parnasim, which maybe I'll talk about a little bit later, nods to the reader, right, to the minister, and sometimes we'll say b'chavod, right, which basically is saying, proceed, right? So in a sense, and the rabbi kind of nods back, right? And the idea is that the rabbi can't just get up and lead the prayers until the lay leader has said, lead the prayers, and then the rabbi accepts and starts leading the prayers, right? So it's like, so we still do it now, because it's the way we've always done it. But there's like this sense of like, once upon a time, it was like a way of like asserting that authority, right? If you look in Bevis Mark Synagogue, you'll see there's like elevated seat where the Parnasim, or once the Muhammad, would have sat. So like they really would have sat almost like in the seats of authority, overseeing the service and kind of governing from their seats. Another thing that shows this is when the scrolls, when the Sefer is taken out of the ark, the Hechal, so you take out the pointer, the Yad. So the person who takes the pointer out is the Parnas, right? Is that, again, once upon a time, the person who would have been on the Muhammad, and they carry it, and when they get to the Teba, to the reader's desk, they will kind of bow towards the minister, the rabbi, the chazan, whoever it is, and hand them the yad, and in a sense, again, kind of like authorizing them, saying like, yes, you may read from the scroll, right? You may read from the Torah, right? So there's a lot of stuff that's kind of been ritually kind of baked into it, but is a reflection of the fact that they were maintaining their sense of authority, right? Even in the religious context as well, of kind of saying, you may proceed, you are authorized, etc. And every service that was like being reminded, the rabbis being reminded, right, of that authority. Another interesting thing is, nowadays we think of, membership dues as like being a really normal thing that you have in Jewish communities, right? So back then they called it the finta. We still call it that in this community, and it was a tax, right? And it was a gradual tax, right? So it depended on your finances, right? So the richer you were, the higher you were taxed. And so you would have had to pay more, right? And so if you were poor, maybe you wouldn't have paid any tax, right? Because you couldn't afford it, right? So membership was this kind of like, it was almost like if you were, for example, in this community, if you were a Sephardi Jew in London, you were a member of the congregation, just like de facto. It wasn't like you could choose not to be, right? You were a member of this congregation because you were Sephardi in London, right? And you were under their authority, whether you asked for it or not. And then you'd be assessed, and you would be taxed accordingly by the finta, right? So nowadays, that's not how we do it, right? There's kind of a fixed, amount, and everyone, in theory pays the same unless someone can't afford, right? And that's kind of the way that it works. But back then, it actually would have been gradual, right? You would have been assessed, and you would have paid your tax accordingly. In fact, you maybe sometimes would have additional tax if you did a big business deal. Then they would they would tax the way that government nowadays would, right? If you just all of a sudden you get a return on your investment, you're going to pay tax on that, right? So it very much kind of operated again in that corporate model, and you were kind of one of the assets of the community. And if you as an asset, brought in more assets, then there was a return to the community. So, and again, you can appreciate you're only there in a sense, again, maybe less so in London, but in other places by dint of the corporate entity of the Jewish community. So in a sense, you had to pay your dues, to that. And again, in pre-modern times, the majority of the community would have been poor, right? In pre-modern times, you have you're either rich or poor, and 90% are poor and 10% are filthy rich, right? So that was kind of the way society's structured, is that the wealthy supported the poor. So they get kind of into the 19th century, you start having a middle class that begins to emerge, and obviously that begins to change kind of expectations and kind of how we think of kind of the, equitable, financial responsibilities across the community, right? And the fact that it's not just for the rich to take care of the poor, but, in any case, things will change as a result of it. But another kind of interesting thing that you'll find is the ability to issue excommunications, right? The cherem, right? So you'll find that they can issue cherem, right? They can excommunicate someone if they don't follow the rules, right? If you breach one of the askamot, right? So in this community, one of the important askamot historically was you cannot establish a separate synagogue. And it went to the fact, right, that you can't even have a minyan in your house unless it was authorized by the Mahamad, right? And there were certain exclusions that if it was maybe, you were getting married tomorrow and you had a group of people that gathered in your house for a minyan, right? But if you just decide, what, and this came up in the early 19th century, we wanted to stay up all night on Shavuot and we'll pray early morning in my house, and we'll have a nice little group that will do that, you could be excommunicated or fined by the community if that wasn't authorized. They were very careful. Again, that goes back to that Charles II thing about not creating division in the community. Depending on where you were, that could make a big difference, right? So you think of in a place where, Jews only have a right to be somewhere as part of this corporate entity of the Jewish community, and you're excommunicated. I mean, that could mean literally maybe that you have to leave, right? Obviously, in other places, that could leave you kind of without any place to affiliate, right? So you think of kind of pre-modern where everyone is part of a religious community and you're excluded from the Jewish community, but you're a Jew. Well, where do you belong, right? So one of the famous examples in Amsterdam is with Spinoza, right? He's excommunicated. He doesn't opt to convert to Christianity. And so he's basically this guy who, his community are just whatever friends he has, right? He doesn't have, community is religion, right? And so, some people refer to him as the first modern Jew because he's like kind of secular as it were. I mean, he wasn't secular, but like he didn't fit, he wasn't in community as it were. In London, you'll have a case of excommunication when you actually have a breakaway from Bevis Marks in 1841 to establish a synagogue in West London that will be reformed, right? And those Jews will be excommunicated for having left and established a new congregation, right? And there's that kind of like authority where they can really kind of like pronounce you and identify you and potentially excommunicate you unless you then apologize, pay a fine, and then they can forgive you. And that can have implications in terms of like burial. If you want to go to synagogue and sit in your seat, you might not be able to do that. You might not be able to come to synagogue, right? So for someone who like that's important to, all of a sudden you can't do that. It's like, whoa, it's like a huge part of your life. So it definitely played a kind of a role of social control, and again help them to kind of maintain a status quo, to kind of in their mind preserve the quiet in the community, and that there shouldn't be potentially things that Jews do that might cause upset. So for example, with Spinoza, right, if he's saying things that are heretical, well, the Christians might also consider it heretical, and then they'll say, oh, look at these Jews spewing heresy. Why are we letting these Jews live in Amsterdam? So the community says, no, we've excommunicated. He's not part of our community. Then at least the Jewish community can say, like, listen, it's not us, and then maybe that does a degree of cover for them. Again, is that exactly what was going on? That's for a dedicated lecture to the Spinoza case, which we'll do sometime in the future. But again, you kind of see these things playing out. Another really interesting kind of example of authority in the community was a regulation that said that you could not print anything without permission. So if you wanted to kind of publish something, you had to get approval from the Muhammad to publish it. So you find it sometime in the 18th century, somebody prints like a translation of the prayer book, and they say, we didn't give you permission. And the guy has to basically withdraw his publication because he hasn't been authorized to do that, even though what he was doing was, I don't know, anything wrong with it or anything problematic with it. But the point is you needed their permission in order to print. And again, I assume it relates to some of these things that we're talking about, which is where they want to kind of like tightly control matters so that there shouldn't be any, too much individuality manifesting itself that would upset the kind of the peace, of the community. So again, very unmodern, right? In the way that we think of kind of the way that communities work, where everything is voluntary and you join if you like it and it resonates with your values and you find it inspiring, and if you don't, you don't, but you can come anyway. It's very different kind of from the way that we think of today. But again, I think that anxiety and kind of that corporate entity that we spoke about kind of explains why it was governed the way that it was. But again, in places like London, where there wasn't as strong of a corporate entity, sometimes there was more tension around some of these things because, well, London is different than Livorno, so why are we governing ourselves in the same way? Maybe there should be some differences as well. And so certainly as you move into the 19th century, you start seeing more kind of upset about this, either because you're talking about the age of reform, where government is reforming, right? There's major change to the way the House of Commons works. You're having an increase in expectations of charities, the idea that you should have elections, things should be more democratic, right? Certainly after the United States is established, right? And there's like this growing sense of the voice of the people, right? And the fact that like community is voluntary and it should be determined based on the people of the community and so on. So you start to see some things changing and different forms kind of coming forward. So one of the things you find in this community in the 19th century is you have another kind of group which is established, which is the members. So anyone who is a member historically called the Yechidim, but now all of a sudden the Yechidim make up an entity in of themselves. And so for the first time in the records of the community, you find the minutes of the meeting of the Yechidim, right? So in a sense, now they have their own body, which has authority, and eventually you'll get to the point where actually the Mahamad are elected, right? Where they're actually not just appointing their successors. For example, the New York Spanish and Portuguese, they still appoint their own successors, right? It's still taking on that older form, but here, right, that's not only the case. There's elections every 3 years, right? It's very much by the books of the Charity Commission, and this is the way kind of charities have to work. And you'll start finding those changes happening in the 19th century. For example, here you kind of have you still have a board of elders, but the board of elders is more of an advisory role, like the House of Lords has become more, and the House of Commons kind of really has all the authority. So nowadays the Mahamad here, called the board now, has that authority. There's a board of elders that's simply advisory, and the members, they'll elect of themselves who's on the Mahamad, right? So it's kind of, it's changed quite a lot. There's no more excommunication, right? That's not the way that works, but you apply for membership, your membership has to be approved, and so on. One of the interesting things you find is in a lot of these Spanish Portuguese communities, you'll actually find like voting boxes. Literally, blackballing is, right? That's what it was, right? So you would have a vote, everyone would have a white or black ball, you toss in whichever one you want. In the end, you open them, and basically if there's one black ball, the motion doesn't pass, right? That's called blackballing someone, right? So in theory, if in New York this is the case, though, it doesn't really happen that way. Like if someone applies for membership there, the current membership needs to approve that person, and in theory somebody could blackball that person, right? So they actually have at their board meetings there of their, it's like their annual membership meeting. They actually have the box there, and then they always kind of make a motion. Shall we dispense with the use of the of the voting box, right? And then you just kind of take a vote, right? So you kind of find these different forms that will kind of try and make their ways out as you start having these shifts in the way the governance works. So even let's say in London, so nowadays we have several Spanish and Portuguese synagogues. So the Mahamad, right, this elected party now, it's an elected board, right? They have the ultimate authority over the whole community, whichever institutions are under it. So the various synagogues, the Kashrut Authority, the Bet Din, and so on. So who sits in the big seats in the synagogue? So what they've done now is they've kind of identified what they call parnasim, which are the wardens. So again, once upon a time it was one and the same with the Mahamad. But since the Mahamad can't be everywhere, so what they've done is that you kind of have local wardens, local parnasim. So you kind of, each synagogue will have its own kind of like local committee. They don't have ultimate authority, but they kind of deal with kind of local matters, including the things that historically the Mahamad would have done on a local level, which is, who gets the first aliyah on Shabbat, kind of what, finalizing what time services will be for Purim, and things like that, things that are kind of just the functioning issues. But still the parnasim will do the things like carry the pointer, nod to the minister to start. Not because they actually have authority over the minister, but because they're kind of sitting in for the Mahamad, who in theory does have that authority over the rabbis or whatever the case is. So it's kind of like really interesting to see that that's the way that that's done. And obviously the most important difference is that today membership is voluntary. And being on the Mahamad is voluntary, right? You're not appointed onto it. You have to be elected, so you have to stand, right? So no one's fined for not standing, right? If you choose not to be a member of the community, that's your right. If you want to be a member of the community, that's your right. There's a lot more democratic kind of approaches to the way the governance works. Again, that reflect the fact that the world has changed quite a lot. And again, you start seeing kind of pushback against some of these things in the 19th century, even, the ability to excommunicate. There's like a real sense that that's not in keeping with the spirit of the age anymore. So in New York, there's a case, I think it's in the 19th century, of people who, I think are clearly not Sabbath observant, and they pass a regulation that say, if you're not keeping the Sabbath, you cannot be called to the Torah on Yom Kippur. So it's like this big thing, and they actually revoke it. They actually kind of the following Yom Kippur revoke that regulation because it's just clear that people have freedom of expression. If you choose not to observe, that's your decision, and we're not excluding people from coming to synagogue because they choose not to. We just say, great to see you. How you been? And things have kind of changed. So it's a really kind of different recognition of yes, there's the traditional expectations, but in practice, we don't impose those, right? If a person chooses to embrace those traditions, great. If they choose not to, that's their choice, but actually people can still be part of the community anyway, right? And so you kind of have this kind of acceptance of the fact that community is diverse, people make different choices, people don't have to hide what they're doing, you're part of the community, and that's kind of, that's a good thing in of itself. And so you really kind of see the way that things evolve. But what's interesting about this, right, and this is the part that's important, right, is how kind of the structures of the community are really deeply rooted in the origins of the community, in the way that these Jewish communities were established as these kind of foreign entities being welcomed into places that without Jews, and how that kind of mimicked or kind of dictated how the community structured itself. Their anxieties around their place in the community dictated some of the kind of strictures of the regulations, the way they organize themselves as like a corporation. But then, after centuries of being in places, and as kind of the world around them changes, there is a degree of evolution that happens internally as well. But if you look carefully enough, you know what you're looking at, you can actually see kind of these vestiges of those earlier structures that continue to manifest, if not in kind of a meaningful way, in more of a ceremonial way, where those things are still here. And so that's kind of just as an intro to kind of the religion and culture of the Western Sephardim, is kind of just getting a sense of how does the community function, and how does the hierarchy within it work, and then kind of once you have that, we can start talking about other elements of the religion and culture of the community in terms of religious traditions and things like that. But all of them, again, you can kind of situate or kind of understand through the lens of understanding the history of these communities. So thank you.